Cramer. Before introducing herself, and I would like to give some information about the Niagara Foundation. What does the Niagara Foundation do? We basically bring people together. This is the mission statement of, kind of the summary of the mission statement of the Niagara Foundation. Other than that, we organize this Niagara forums, and we try to do this once a month or once in 2 months, and we try to keep up with that. And another thing that we do is intercultural trips to Turkey. So we have been doing this for the last 6 years. And each year we organize a group from the legislators and a group from the academicians. And beginning from this year, we also want to extend our mission to other non-profit organizations in the greater Madison area. And another thing that we do is State House reception. And this year it's gonna be the third one, and it's gonna be on February 26th. And we have a keynote speaker from the Turkic Alliance, which is based in New York, and it's kind of an umbrella organization which includes almost all Turkic organizations throughout the US. And we also organize a friendship dinner, and this year's dinner is going to be either in September or October, and you'll know that if you receive our emails, and you'll know about that. And finally, we give Dialogue and Peace Awards, and this year's awards is being organized by our Milwaukee office. And they're gonna give this awards in Milwaukee, and hopefully next year we'll do it here in Madison. So after this brief overview of the Niagara Foundation, I would like to introduce Professor Kathy Cramer, and the professor in the Department of Political Science, and is an affiliate faculty member in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, the La Follette School of Public Affairs, the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology, and the Wisconsin Center for the Advancement of Post-Secondary Education. And she got her BA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1994, and her PhD from University of Michigan in 2000. Her work focuses on the way people in the United States make sense of politics and their place in it. She is known for her innovative approach to the study of public opinion, in which she invites herself into the conversation of groups of people to listen to the way they understand public affairs. She has also published as Catherine Cramer Walsh, and is the author of Talking About Race, Community Dialogues and the Politics of Difference from the University of Chicago Press in 2007, and Talking About Politics, Informal Groups and Social Identity in American Life, again from the University of Chicago Press in 2004, and also co-author of Democracy at Risk, How Political Choices Have Undermined Citizenship and What We Can Do About It. She is the recipient of the 2012 APSA Qualitative and Multi-Method Research Section Award for the Best Qualitative and Multi-Method Submission to the American Political Science Review, a 2006 UW-Madison Chancellor's Distinguished Teaching Award, and a 2012-2014 UW-Madison Villas Associate Award. Please welcome Professor Catherine Cramer.
The Niagara Foundation for inviting me. I am very honored to be here, not just to share my thoughts with all of you, but because the Niagara Foundation, it seems to me, cares about many of the things that motivate my research, namely how can we get along better? So I'm not sure I have the answers to that today, but I'm going to leave ample time for us to talk with one another. I'm not going to give you a very uplifting story today, but hopefully it will be one step toward better understanding what's going on here in Wisconsin. So how many of you were living in Madison at the time of the gubernatorial recall in 2012? Most everybody, right? Okay. If you can think back to the night before that election, how many of you thought that Scott Walker would not win, that Tom Barrett would win? It's okay, raise your hand. Yeah. Living in Madison, it seemed like there was not much support for Scott Walker, right? And we all, myself included, thought I was going to be up late that night, watching the returns, waiting to see who actually had won, but it was over by 10 p.m., right? Scott Walker won with 53.1% of the vote, and it was a shock to a lot of people living in Madison. And at the time, I was in the middle of this research, and I was asked many times, what is going on out there? How can people possibly vote for Scott Walker? Why do they hate us so much, right? They, meaning people in Wisconsin, why do they hate public employees, those of us working at the university and other people working in government jobs in town? Why do they hate us so much? What is going on? So what I want to present to you today is a partial answer to that, what I learned about what is going on. And I'm going to start it off by not saying why do people hate Scott, or why do people hate public employees, and why do people support Scott Walker, but with a bigger question, and that is, why do people support small government? Why are they in favor of, say, asking public employees to pay in more to their health care and pension, undercutting public employee unions, wanting smaller government, wanting to pay fewer taxes with fewer government programs? Where does that view come from? Sometimes the way this question gets asked is, why do people vote against their interests? Why do low-income people not want, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not being a very good guest, am I? Sorry. Okay. Why do people not want to pay higher taxes so that they can have health care, especially when they can't afford to pay health insurance themselves? What is going on there? So I'm going to try to have you come with me to ask, not why are people getting it wrong? How can they be so stupid, is sometimes the way it's put, right? But instead, how are they getting it? How are they understanding the world? How are they thinking about government and their place in it, if there is one? So here's what I did, and pardon me, sometimes it's a little bit slow because I have pictures in here. Here's how I come at this question as a political scientist. When I want to know how are people understanding politics, how are they interpreting politics, I think about the question of understanding in general. And psychologists tell us that much of the time when people are doing the task of understanding, they're categorizing the world. They come across something, a person, an object, and their mind operates as if they're asking, what is this an example of? What category does this fall into? What type of person is this? In the political world, oftentimes that, is this a Democrat or Republican? What type of a candidate or a person is this, for example? So I'm going to show you what I heard by trying to listen to the categories people use to try to understand the political world in Wisconsin, but even more broadly. A few things I want to just sort of announce now, and you'll get in short order, is that I understand public opinion as not just something that people offer up when a pollster calls them, but something that we create together in conversation. So for example, if someone is asked a question by a pollster and they talk about an issue one way, but then later on in the day they have a conversation with friends and they talk about the issue in a slightly different way, what is their true opinion? Both, right? So I focus on public opinion as a social fact because I think in our conversations, the opinions that we create do matter for our individual opinions, the things we offer up to pollsters and people in the voting booth, but also because we all make assessments of what people think based on what we hear in our everyday life. We do it, politicians do it. Politicians, especially lower levels of government politicians, don't have access to polling, a whole lot of polling on their constituents. Instead, They often do what they call polling by walking around. They talk with people. We do the same thing. So that's one of the slightly different understanding of public opinion than you might normally get. The other thing I want to say is that what I'm going to tell you is not what all people in Wisconsin think. The data that I gathered is not good for that. Instead, it's good for how are people making sense of politics. What's going on when someone is expressing resentment towards public employees? What kind of considerations are going through their head? So here's what I learned, or I should first tell you, here's what I did. It's just a little slow because of the pictures there. Oh, sorry. Okay, so what I did was back in May, or in 2000 really, and I started this project in May of 2000, I carved up the state into different regions based on political leanings, population density, racial and ethnic diversity, type of agriculture, type of industry, just a variety of factors. And then in each of these different regions, I sampled different communities, some big communities, some small communities. And then what I did, once I had sampled a community, and there's 27 plotted on here that are basically anonymous, although you'll get some sense of where I went. This is just to give you a sense that I went a variety of places. But once I had sampled a place, I called up the local newspaper editor or a UW Extension educator, and I said, where in such and such Wisconsin do people get together on a regular basis that I might get access to them? Where can I go to visit with people, to invite myself into conversations, basically? And here are some of the places that they told me to go. Cafes, like a Madison-type cafe, sometimes a diner on Main Street, oftentimes a gas station. Gas stations in many communities in Wisconsin and other places are the place where you go to get the news in the morning. The coffee's not great, but the conversation is usually very up to date. Those are the people who know what's going on. Yeah, and this one is my favorite, and pardon me for repeating jokes for those of you who heard me talk about this before, but I always show the picture of this gas station because it's down the street from the world's largest talking cow. Yes. Sometimes I would be pointed to a place that serves a lot of functions in a community. This one is the hardware store and the gas station, the grocery store, gift shop, liquor store. I'm sure I'm forgetting something, but it's also the place where you get the news as well. Sometimes I had to be a little bit more creative. There wasn't an obvious place to go in a given community. So for example, on the north side of Milwaukee, I wanted to be sure to talk to some African Americans. And the diners I went to, I was always there at the wrong time of day. It just didn't quite work out. So instead, someone invited me to meet with a group of activists that gathered every morning after their church service on a Sunday morning. So there are a variety of other groups, and I'd be happy to say more about them, but I want to just cut to the chase and tell you what I heard. So there was a lot. I was looking again for what categories people use to understand politics, and you can probably tell in my comments already that much of the time when people are figuring out a political issue, the categories become about people and what the dividing lines are, what the battle lines are, who's against us, who's for us versus them. And the one I want to tell you about that I was not looking for and surprised me, given that I grew up in Wisconsin, was a very substantial and common across the places I visited, rural versus urban divide, which I call rural consciousness, which is a social sciencey, political sciencey term for a view of the world that's rooted in place and social class and carries with it a sense that I'm a rural person, I identify as a rural person, and I also have a sense that rural folks are on the short end of the stick in a variety of ways. And here's what I mean. So there's this sense, and you probably don't need a map of Wisconsin, but I'll show it to you in just a minute, that much of the time when people talked about politics and other issues in rural areas, they had a map of the world in which there's Madison and Milwaukee, and then there's the rest of us. And sometimes that rest of us is called outstate Wisconsin. That ruffles a few feathers in certain places and not others, but here's Wisconsin. And as you all know, Madison and Milwaukee are down here, and then there's a lot of rest of geography of the state, right? There's many other places in the state, and people feel as though, in rural areas, feel as though all the attention is down in the cities in Madison and Milwaukee. And let me say a little in more detail what I mean by that. There's a sense that when people talk about Madison, they're not just talking about the legislature or UW-Madison, but both. They think of Madison as a place where a lot of important decisions are made and then communicated outward to the rest of the state. And that they feel that there's not listening going on. That those of us down here in the cities, or sometimes they're called the M&Ms. Yeah, have many of you heard that term before? It was new to me. I've lived 20 years in this state. New to me, actually more than 20 years, 25 at least by that point. And there's a sense that, you know, those of us down here in the cities make all the important decisions that just are tone deaf to the rest of the state. There's also a sense it's not just about listening or who has decision-making power, but that the cities, the M&Ms, are where all the resources go. So oftentimes I would hear a similar phrase that, you know, Madison sucks in all our dollars, spends them on Milwaukee or on itself, and we never see any in return. So we're the resource suck. There's also this sense that, again, I basically said this already, but the sense that power, they're on the short end of the stick with respect to power, and also they're on the short end of the stick with respect to respect. And that those of us in the cities do not understand rural life, what rural life is like. Not only do we not understand it, but we don't really respect it. We think, we see the results of the election, the gubernatorial election, and we think a bunch of racist rednecks, right? Like ignorant. It's common. And it's okay to chuckle. Unfortunately, there's this sense of being the victims of injustice is not just about money and not just about power, but it's about values and culture and lifestyles too. So there's many layers to it. It's complex. I want to give you some examples of what this sounded like in these conversations. So here's an example of, let's see, this was a group of people who met in the basement of a church once a week, because that was the one building that was basically a public building in the community. It was a very, very small town. And it would be farmers and retirees, stay-at-home moms, and then a few small business owners who just took time off to take part in this gathering. And one woman is telling me that she's trying to convey to me just how disrespected they feel. And she's telling me, she's a former teacher, she says, as a former educator, I resented highly comments such as, there is no education north of Highway 8. So let me just go back to the map here quick. Highway 8 is up there, it cuts through Leona and Ladysmith and St. Croix Falls. And there's this sense that people see everything north of Highway 8 as this beautiful, tourist, idyllic place, and that everyone up there is living these laid-back, leisurely vacation lives. But the people north of Highway 8 say, we resent that because they don't understand that when the weather finally gets nice up here, we're working 3 jobs to make ends meet, because yes, you know, it's this beautiful tourist haven, but working in the tourism industry is very uncertain and not great pay. So she was telling me about Highway 8, and she says, there's no education north of Highway 8. And she's saying that this is the perception. These kids they're not educated. And she said, and we send them such absolutely excellent and well-prepared students there, that the attitude that we're the hick area of the state, it was painful. And I said, so where did you get that from? Where did you get that perception from? I said, where'd you get that from? Recruiters? And she said, professors. And I said, really? When they would visit here? She said, yeah, or publish in newspaper articles, and that was just a little distressful, because I think northern Wisconsin feels a little far away from Madison anyway. And we keep waving our hands and saying, yoo-hoo, there's another half of a state up here. Up north is not Wausau. So Wausau is in the middle of the state. I don't know about you, but I grew up in Grafton, which is, you know, here. And that was up north to me when I was growing up. So here's just another brief example, another similar type of group, people meeting once a week, and I'm asking specifically about UW-Madison here, and so they're telling me, I'm asking about UW-Madison, but notice the way they respond. It's not just about the university. So I say, what do you think the University of Wisconsin-Madison does not do well? When you think about it, and they jump right in, unfortunately. Martha says, represents our area. I mean, we're strange to Madison. They want us to do everything for Madison's laws and the way they do things, but we totally live differently than the city people live. So they need to think more rural instead of all this city area. And our friend Donna says, we can't afford to educate our children like they can in the cities. It's as simple as that. We don't have the advantages. And Ethel says, all the things they do, they're based on Madison and Milwaukee, never us. Martha says, yeah, we don't have the advantages that they give their local people there, I think a lot of times. And it's probably because they don't understand how rural people live and what we deal with and our problems. So, again, not uplifting, but there's the picture, kind of the contours of what it looks like. All right, so here's the next question. Isn't this just racism? When people talk about those people in the cities, is it just another way of being, say, racist, or being resentful towards people of color in a form? There's no doubt, my answer is not totally. That doesn't capture everything that's going on here. There's no doubt that when people say those people in the city, some of that is racialized. I mean, we know from very solid psychological experiments that when the term inner city is used, it can invoke racial images, it can invoke racial resentment and influence the way people think about issues. We know, I mean, racism is a fact of life here in Madison and in the nation, and because of the way we are so racially segregated, oftentimes cities are equated with people of color, and that's probably very likely in the mind of folks as they're talking to me, no doubt about it. However, I don't want you to walk away from things I'm saying today and think that everything I'm hearing boils down to people in rural areas are racist and that explains how they're thinking about politics today. I don't think that captures it, because oftentimes the resentment that I'm hearing towards people in the cities is about resentment towards decision makers or wealthy folks or people in power. They're often talking about people like me as they're talking to me. So on the one hand, you have to take everything that I'm telling you with a grain of salt, as you should any speaker, right? But also because I'm telling you what they told to me, so my presence kind of influences what they're going to say. But given that I am who I am, I'm a reasonably kind, polite, mild-mannered person, and I've given them a business card that says I work for the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the level of animosity they communicated to me about public employees, about Madison, about what they see as this injustice is kind of amazing, really, if you think about it in that way. All right, so now let me explain how this view of the world is related to wanting less government. Because I'll tell you, in some of these conversations, some of the people I'm talking to do not have teeth. They do not have health insurance, dental care. They clearly, in some interpretations, would benefit from more government spending. Why do they then not want it, right? And that is a very liberal kind of framework for looking at this question. Hopefully you'll find it advantageous in the following respect. In general, in my studies, I have not just visited groups spending time in rural areas, but in suburban and urban areas too. And across all these groups and across public opinion polls in general, we know that the public is pretty ambivalent about small government. There are times when politicians have been very good at telling us that the outcome of a vote, say Prop 13 in California, is a sign that people want less government. But oftentimes it's a much smaller issue that people are responding to in a vote, and that signal of wanting less government is not necessarily a principled stand on we need to scale back government in general. But that ambivalence often gets ignored in many of the political debates. But I want you to just have it in mind as I'm sharing these conversations with you, because in the conversations I see people not being necessarily sure what they want in political issues, but trying to struggling with how much government should we have, how big should government be, what should be its role. However, it's very clear that across all types of people, there's a lot of disenchantment with government. So there's a lot of distrust in government. But that is not the same as wanting less government. It's possible to think that government's doing a bad job, but not necessarily want to scale it back. It's also possible to think that government's doing a great job and still want to scale it back. They're not necessarily the same thing, although oftentimes in politicians' rhetoric, which I'll show you a little bit of in a moment, you can see people trying to take that idea that no one's listening to you, you don't like government, you don't trust government, and to parlay that into, therefore, let's hack it, let's cut it back, let's get rid of government as much as we possibly can. Also, across all types of groups, when people talk about policies and whether or not they support them, oftentimes the conversation becomes about who the perceived recipients of the policy are and whether or not they're deserving. And whether or not they're deserving almost always hinges on some notion of whether or not they work hard. Have they worked for their benefit? Have they worked hard? And so the rural consciousness comes into play here, because oftentimes when people are talking about policies or public employees, the lens that they're using is, are these people who work hard like people like me, like rural folks who have it so rough and have to work multiple jobs and work with their hands a lot of times, as opposed to you all, me and myself included, I don't mean to be pointing to you, but as opposed to those folks down in Madison who sit behind a desk all day, right? They've never worn their body out. They have health care and they're not wearing their body out. Where's the fairness in that, right? Or sometimes it comes across as simply as, you all down in Madison, you take a shower before you go to work. I don't. I work so hard I have to shower when I get home. It means the kind of that crisp in some of these conversations where there's a sense of like, I work hard, those people don't. So let me give you some examples in their own words. Here's an example of how people are not necessarily opposed to government spending, but as they talk through an issue, their rural consciousness comes into play, and it makes them think that more spending would not be appropriate here. Education is a great example. So sometimes the conversation would be about the pride in the local schools and how afraid people were about school consolidation, because the school meant so much to the community as a source of good education for the kids, but also a source of activities for the local people, and also a source of identity. Like sometimes people would just say to me, when the school left, the town did too. And people would say, some of them would even say, we're willing to spend more on education, but all of our money goes to Madison, it gets spent on Milwaukee or Madison, it's never going to come back to us. So no, we're not going to have higher taxes so we can have better education. So even though people might be willing to spend more, they see that wherever their taxes are going, it's not going to benefit them, therefore they don't want higher taxes. Here's a conversation that helps illustrate the way rural consciousness comes into play a little bit too. This is a group of women who get together once a week. They're just a group of friends, and it's a far northwestern community in the state. And I'll just give you an excerpt here in the interest of time. Here's a woman kind of boiling down this sentiment about where their money goes. They're a pretty left-leaning group. They're in a community that's kind of an artist community, and so there's quite a few Democrats in that part. And actually, that part of the state, it's a little bit of a complicated history, but there's 3 counties up there that tend to vote Democratic. So it's not a very conservative group. And yet, Sue, this woman I'll call Sue, says, I think that, shared revenue in the state of Wisconsin, it's always going to be that way. She's talking about just the unfairness of distribution of money. The money's collected here, it is sent to Madison, and it is dispersed to Milwaukee and Madison primarily, and so our return on what we spend is very little, and we struggle with our school system here for those reasons. So there's just an example of how people are perhaps willing to spend more, but they think if they do, it's not going to come back to their community. All right, so the other side of this is that these are not just sentiments that are out there in the public. In my view, my fieldwork started in 2007. So much of the animosity towards Madison and this feeling that public employees don't work hard was there well before Scott Walker was on most of our radars. It's something to keep in mind. But where do these sentiments come from? Right? The seeds are sown somewhere. People get these ideas from somewhere. I don't have an answer to that. But what I can show you is the way Scott Walker was pretty adept at tapping into them. And I can't show you, I can't give you causal evidence, but what I'm going to show you is just a few excerpts of things he said during the gubernatorial campaign and the recall election. What does it look like when politicians tap into this? Well, for us, sometimes it looks like a train, a high-speed train. Here's what I mean. In the gubernatorial primary, so Walker's not even the Republican candidate yet, in the very first debate, here's what he said. Now, I should give a little background. So are all of you familiar with the high-speed train that had been allocated to Wisconsin, and then Walker said, we're not taking those funds because those are taxpayer funds? Well, here's basically what his argument sounded like. If you look at what Jim Doyle and Tom Barrett, was Walker's Democratic opponent to be, but he didn't know that yet, have put on the table in spending $810 million on a high-speed train line between Milwaukee and Madison. I'm going to emphasize certain words here so you get what I'm saying. Milwaukee and Madison, with no assurance that it will go to Eau Claire or La Crosse or anywhere else. It's just about those two areas, and it's about taking that money that will cost the citizens of Wisconsin up to $10 million more per year, according to their numbers. I think it will actually be much more. That's $10 million that doesn't go to fix the road. It goes up from West Salem through the cutout up to Black River Falls. It doesn't fix streets in La Crosse. That's money that's taken away from our local roads and our bridges and our other transportation needs today. He's saying, Wisconsinites, like me, us, this money's not going to us. It's going to those people in the cities, right? What's kind of amazing about this is Scott Walker's the Milwaukee County executive, right? And he's running against the city of Milwaukee, and very adeptly so. He basically, I don't have an exact quote here with me, but he talked repeatedly about how he it was a great thing that he was had this experience as Milwaukee County executive because he had shown that he could take on the political machine in Milwaukee. Also, at times when he talked about public employees, roughly 10% of every community in Wisconsin, 10% of the workers are employed by some form of government. So public employees are not just those of us in Madison, right? But that's the rhetoric that we were given. So for example, here's an example of him talking to American Enterprise Institute after Act 10 had been proposed and after the protest, but I believe this is before the gubernatorial or the recall election. And he says, he's talking about the budget repair bill, Act 10, and why he had done what he'd done. And he said, we were able to rein in abuses of things like overtime and other excesses out there by no longer having opportunities where, in our case, some of our state employees could literally call in sick on their shift and then come back to work the next shift on overtime. Or bus drivers in places like Madison that make $150,000 or more because of overtime. Those things have all changed, and now the power is back in the hands of local officials and ultimately the taxpayers of our state. And so that's ultimately what we did. It seems pretty reasonable when you hear us talk about it. So you can see the way